The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day confrontation between the United States of America and the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis was caused by the attempt to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba by the United States, also known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The purpose of the Bay of Pigs invasion was to create a non-communist government that was friendly towards America. The plan was supposed to be secretive, but it soon became common knowledge to Cuban exiles in Florida. The detailed plan had included 2 airstrikes against Cuban airbases, a 1,400-man invasion, paratroopers dropping before the invasion to disrupt transportation and repel Cuban forces. Finally, a smaller force would land on the east coast of Cuba to create confusion. After the attack was successful, Kennedy planned to send South Floridians to Cuba to form a new government. Although the plan was very intricate and well thought out, there was no guarantee for success. The success depended on the support from the Cubans themselves, some of which didn't favor their government. Unfortunately, nearly all of the targets were missed. This sent a huge alert to Cubans. Castro's counterattack consisted of shooting down American aircraft and sending 20,000 troops to the Cuban shore to prevent further invasions. Castro kept 1,200 American soldiers as hostages for over a year and a half, and finally released them after making a deal with President Kennedy for $53 million in baby food and pharmaceutical products. After the initial attack, a secret agreement was made between the Soviets and Cuba to have Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuban soil to deter any future American invasions. Construction of these missiles began in the summer of 1962, but America gained knowledge of them just months later in September. After President John F. Kennedy learned of the missile sites, he issued a public warning against the introduction of destructive weapons in Cuba. He went on national television to alert the public about the events and to alert them about the consequences of what could happen if handled properly. During my interview, I asked my grandmother Janet Burgess what she was thinking when she heard about the Cuban Missile Crisis. She replied, "When we heard about the Cuban Missile Crisis building up before the showdown, everyone was petrified and terrified. When the finale came, no one slept or ate. Everyone was glued to their TVs."
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote.
I asked her how people around her were reacting to it. She said people were very quiet. They were glued to their TVs. A lot of people went to their places of worship and prayed. People were scared and didn't take it lightly. I then asked her how it personally affected her. She said, "My youth was during the Second World War, so we dealt with all that. I was 4 or 5 years old. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was married with 3 children, and your first instinct is to protect your children. It put a fear and uncertainty in my life that I had never felt before." Kennedy did not resort to violence immediately. He had the American Navy blockade Cuba to show that America was ready to fight if they made the first move. This brought fear on Cubans and Americans alike. Many people feared that the world was on the brink of nuclear war. Much like my grandmother, a young mother of 3 whose main concern was caring for and protecting her kids. After several messages were sent back and forth between President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, they finally came to a compromise. I asked my grandma if she thought it was handled properly. She answered, "Yeah, the Pentagon wanted him to go to war. Kennedy thought about the children, homes, families, and people who would never have the chance to grow up and see life. He fought in World War II to see what war was like to people. He would rather come up with a non-violent solution than fire missiles at each other because that would get nothing done." I then asked her how she reacted when she found out that she was safe. She said, "I got on my hands and knees and thanked God. I did not sleep for 3 days. It was when the world was on a total brink of destruction and it had been avoided."
While the public debate went on, the American and Russian leaders kept in contact. Khrushchev, in a letter received the next day, accused Kennedy of threatening him and the Soviet Union with the blockade, and he was not going to observe it. The United States, he said, was pushing mankind to the abyss of a worldwide nuclear war. In fact, the Russian ships bringing more rockets to Cuba soon began to slow down, indicating they were not going to challenge the American blockade. But Kennedy still had to get rid of the missiles and told the Russians this. Khrushchev thereupon sent two messages, one reasonable, the other uncompromising. The first said that if Kennedy would promise that America would not attack Cuba and would lift the blockade, then the question of removal or destruction of the missile sites would be an entirely different one. Kennedy agreed to the terms of the first letter, and on the 28th of October, the Russians ordered their ships to return, taking the rockets with them.
After the compromise, the United States took a new approach on foreign affairs.
Now the way seemed open for a new approach.
We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world.
Since then, hotlines have been created between Washington and Moscow to quickly diffuse problems so that they aren't brought to the level that they were during the missile crisis.
The Washington-Moscow Hotline, a safeguard against hotheads in the Cold War, is installed in the Pentagon. Simultaneously, the other end of the teletyping circuit is being hooked up in the Kremlin. This direct communication between the Soviet and American governments is designed to curtail misunderstanding and miscalculation that might touch off a nuclear war.
Although everything turned out in the end, there was not denying that America was on the brink of nuclear war. Castro was ready to use nuclear force if he needed to.
Is it the case that you wrote to Premier Khrushchev saying that if the United States did invade Cuba, the response should be a Soviet first strike, that is, a nuclear strike against the U.S.? Were we that close to nuclear war?
Yes, we were very close to the nuclear war, extremely close. Yes, I said to Khrushchev, there is going to be an attack. In that case, do not give your adversary the possibility of a first strike that catches you off guard.
The enduring understanding of this film is that you never know when conflict is coming your way, and when it does, you may not have any control over what happens or how it will affect you. Like many tragic moments in history, things are way out of people's control. People have to have complete faith in the government that they will make the correct decisions, and unfortunately sometimes the decisions benefit the government more than the people. But in this case, everything worked out in the end and everyone was safe.